Welcome into another edition of the Hang Time Podcast. Sekou Smith here in Atlanta. My main man, John Schuman's in New Jersey. John Hart's behind the glass. And a wild Wednesday night around the NBA. The Orlando Magic spoiled Jimmy Butler's Sixers debut. Dwayne Casey gets the monster homecoming win in his return to Toronto. And it was all overshadowed, like normal, by LeBron James, scoring 44 points to pass Wilt Chamberlain for fifth on the NBA's all-time scoring list. To help us discuss these storylines and break down a whole lot more, let's bring in our guest today, former Hawks GM Wes Wilcox. You know him as a GM. I've known him for so long. I mean, he's been in press rooms 20 years, it seems like, doing all sorts of things around this league. Wes, how you doing, man? Good to have you joining us. And I'm curious, even in your current situation as a quote-unquote former GM, how much basketball do you watch? And because I think people don't understand just how immersed in the game you have to be to stay current, man. How much of the NBA game do you still watch on a daily basis?
Well, Sekou, it's great to be with you guys. Talk about how much time we spend in media rooms. You know, that's the fun stuff when you're out there kind of grinding away, learning the league. But like how much watching now? I mean, every night, you know, every morning, 3-4 games, whatever you can fit in. Now you start to trend a little bit away from the NBA just because you feel like there's a college game or two you want to try to catch it. You know, a morning or an afternoon. But, you know, you usually try to catch one or two at night, and then, you know, everybody DVRs and we record them. And one of the benefits of being a former GM is you have plenty of time to watch a ton of basketball. So that's we've been watching a lot.
Yeah. What are your initial thoughts on how the Wolves handled Jimmy Butler's trade request and ultimately, you know, trading him to Philly, getting him out of the Western Conference? You know, how does a move like that affect the entire league and the trade market in particular, in terms of who else might be on the verge of getting dealt, or who else might be in the market to make a move now that a big move has been made? Yeah,
it's unusual for a trade to go down, you know, prior to December 15th, when most of the players signed, not all the players, but most of the players signed in the offseason are eligible to be traded. And there's always, as we know, right, the prioritization of players. The first domino to fall, obviously, you know, oftentimes triggers, you know, other players to be kind of opened up to be traded. And so a player of this magnitude to be traded this early, obviously the request starting right before training camp, but it's all about, you know, setting your expectations in one of these trades. And it's hard when it becomes public from a front office perspective. And you hope that this is a deal that's, you know, good for both, good for Philly, and that they get, you know, an all NBA type player in his prime, and Minnesota is able to add, you know, 2 quality rotation players to their current team that may fit better with their kind of young core in Wiggins and Towns. So you hope this one's good for both. And, you know, it's interesting. Minnesota's won 2 games since the trade. And, you know, Philly, I think they're up big last night, 16 with about, you know, 10.5 to play in the game. And it was an unbelievable finish. And they gave it away there at the end. So it'll certainly be interesting to watch. Philly's going to be a really interesting dynamic with how their team's all going to fit together, especially their new big 3.
Hey, Wes, from an analytical perspective, you know, we sort of learn a lot about teams in the first 20 games. Like, we can look at the standings in the first 20 games and see, say, the 16 teams that are in playoff position, and know that like 13 or 14 of them are going to be on average in playoff position come the end of the season. So, like, is it sort of the same thing on the inside, and our teams now starting to come to the realization of what they are and who they are? We're a little less than 2 weeks away now from the 1/4 mark of the season, where every team has played about 19 or 20 games. How much significance does that sort of part of the season have on a front office as far as learning what you are and what you need to do going forward?
Yeah, John, I'd say a lot. You know, especially for the teams that maybe their expectations aren't in line or aren't lining up with, you know, with their results. You know, 2 teams that jump out. Now, Washington has won a couple games here recently, but Washington being a tax team, high payroll, high profile, and to this point in the year, you know, really struggled because of, you know, who knows what the internal factors are, but certainly the defensive side of the ball, you know, and they just haven't shared the ball. So a team like Washington, for sure, you're starting to get a little bit concerned, though you get Dwight back and, you know, you win a couple more games. And then a team like Cleveland.
In the Eastern Conference.
Yeah, and you're in the Eastern Conference. And then a team like Cleveland that comes into the year with the clear expectation, or at least that's what, you know, the messaging, both kind of internally and publicly, was that they were going to compete to win. And, you know, they've had a major shakeup, of course, and obviously the injury to Kevin Love, but Kevin Love's not going to make the difference from where they are now to being like a real, middle of the pack playoff team in the East. And we've seen this when a great player leaves a team, and none more recently than LeBron, having just a massive impact on their direction. So, and then from the rest of the league, you're trying to get a sense of who the buyers are, who the sellers are, and where the dominoes are going to fall. And we've already seen the big one in Jimmy fall. And so now it's, who's next that you might be able to add to your team. And, for a team like Philly, going back to them, they're going to, this new roster balance is going to be really interesting. The third best player of a trio oftentimes has to sacrifice. We see this, Chris Bosh did it in Miami with Wade and LeBron. Kevin Love did it in Cleveland with Kyrie and LeBron. Harden did it. Now it was early, but Harden came off the bench and did it with Westbrook and Kevin Durant. And even Klay Thompson. Klay Thompson is like the perfect number 3. I can't think of one in history that is better than Klay because he's so efficient, doesn't need the ball, and can allow Steph and KD to have it. And then Draymond's like also the perfect number 3 or number 4, however you want to say it, currently on that team. And so, how is all of this going to impact Ben Simmons? And how is it going to impact Fultz and the need to add shooting to that team? You're going to see it probably more with, Landry Shamet playing and Houston trying to maybe enter the trade market for one of these teams that may be underperforming, that may be a seller. There's been a lot of speculation about Philly buying, and Philly's certainly going to need more shooting. And then that leads you to, how is Simmons going to be impacted? Because the ball is going to be with both Embiid and Butler. So this is a super fun time of the year, the run up, that first 20 games and then into the trade deadline.
I thought it was interesting last night. Brett Brown sort of liked to pair starters together, like as far as substitution patterns. Their starting lineup together played only 10 minutes, but then he likes to have like 2 starters on the floor at one time. And I thought it was interesting that the 2 Sixers that played the most together last night were Simmons and Butler, which I would have thought, you separate them. But basically, Butler was on the floor for all of Simmons' minutes, and Butler played maybe an extra minute or so without Simmons. And I thought that was kind of interesting that the 2 primary ball handlers you would think were on the floor together most instead of staggered. But maybe that's just a 1-game experiment or just trying to get them to learn together early on in their time together, or if it's sort of the plan going forward.
Well, no doubt this is going to be an on-the-fly experiment for Philly and their staff as they try to, integrate a player of this magnitude in, when games really matter. And so all of that stuff is probably going to be worked through. And this is a great challenge. You mentioned a great point in the challenge to the coaching staff. Like, they're going to figure out how to try to maximize their group and their rotations and their lineups. And so this will be, this one is going to be fun to watch.
Wes, I'm curious, we spend so much time focusing on the on-court mechanics of how a team works, but from a front office perspective, and for the people charged with managing a roster today, tomorrow, into the future, how difficult is it when you have to factor in the sorts of things that the Warriors have going on right now with Draymond and KD? And that's an extreme case. We're talking about one of the best teams in the history of the league. But even on a daily basis for a front office group, how delicate is that balance of managing what's happening on the court and keeping that aligned, and then trying to make sure you're doing all the right things to manage the off-the-court environment that these players are working in?
Yeah, Sekou, you know how large of a job that is when you start to layer in, family, friends, media, agent, career path, upcoming events like free agency kind of layered into all this. Mm-hmm. It's a massive challenge. And that's why, having a great coach and great stability in your ownership is such an advantage. And that's why you see these franchises that win continue to win. And Steve Kerr's obviously done a phenomenal job. Bob Myers and their ownership group has really committed to keep this run going in a way that, there was a lot of speculation of how much they were going to be willing to spend to keep this thing together. Mm-hmm. And they've really spent, and they have 2 great leaders. And then Steph Curry is, I've never been around Steph, other than Kent Bazemore's wedding last year. And, but you just watch him and you can just see his joy and how much he brings that group together. And so my guess would be this will pass in Golden State, but it's a real thing, and there's real team dynamics, and it's emotional, it's raw. And my gut is that, they'll get through this. And this is probably more about time and delivery, time and place and delivery. Yeah. How all this happened in a very public setting, and then how it was said, versus if this was a conversation behind closed doors that was a concern and delivered kind of in like an empathetic way, this probably would have gone over in a much different way. Right. But Golden State's probably going to be just fine.
Yeah. And I think, Wes, I always tell, friends of mine who are like, man, they watch the games and assume that 48 minutes is it. Like, you go to work, you're on the stage, and then that's it. It's over. And I'm like, man, that's just such a small piece of what an NBA season entails, in terms of all of the logistics, all of the managing of different things that goes on. Do you think the front office job now is even more difficult than it might have been, say, 10, 15 years ago because of all the other things you have to keep a finger on in terms of, you mentioned it, the families and the agents, the media and social media and all this other stuff that didn't exist the first time you set foot, in an NBA organization?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest change, it's hard to speculate as what it was and the stresses of, any generation, because I'm sure during that time there were stresses that were, equally challenging as to what we're dealing with today. However, the one major difference that we've seen is social media.
Yeah.
And that has had, ripples across generation, this new generation for sure. And everything seems to be just more openly shared. Everything seems to be a little more public. And so I don't know if that's leading to, more of these public trade requests, because players are used to sharing the rest of their lives. Why wouldn't they just share this part of their life? And so that has created a dynamic on top of all the other things that you mentioned. Or that we've talked about, that is very new, and it's a massive challenge. And so now there's more interest around it because there's more information, it's more public. Now there's more media. The media does a great job of building relationships and, kind of telling the story in a way that we probably never heard before. And so that part of the job is really a new dynamic. And I will say in the two most recent situations, in Houston, kind of with the Melo stuff, and with Golden State with this Draymond and KD incident, the way both organizations have handled it with their GMs being available and addressing it, whether you like what they said or didn't like what they said, just the fact that these organizations are taking it on, are talking about it openly. Like you gotta give both Daryl Morey and Bob Myers credit for how they've handled this, because I think they've taken it head on, and that's probably the best way to handle it.
Do you think there's something, we talked about this on Monday, I think there's something missing in the Carmelo story though. Like, yeah, he hasn't played well, and they haven't been good with him on the floor, and he's not a great fit. But like, what was the breaking point to where he's no longer with the team? Like, what was it that went from, okay, you're playing behind? I mean, is there something internal where somebody said, this guy, we can't deal with this? Is it something with him where he can't accept playing behind somebody named Gary Clark in the rotation? Or the potential, like, did they say, hey, there might be a game where you don't play? Like, Michael Carter-Williams has been DNP'd like 6 straight games. But hey, Michael Carter-Williams is on the bench cheering his teammates on, whereas Melo, is now not around. I said the same exact thing as you, is that give credit for the Rockets for Daryl talking to the media. But Daryl and D'Antoni are both saying, hey, Melo's catching too much flack for this situation. He's not to blame for everything that, for our whatever 5-7 start or whatever it was at the time. So like, why isn't he there? That's my question. Like, why isn't he doing the Vince Carter thing or the Dwayne Wade thing where, okay, I'm not who I am, but I can still play a role. And the Rockets, as much of an issue as he's been, they should be able to still find a couple of moments where he can contribute. He should still be available as an emergency guy, even if he's not a regular part of the rotation.
Yeah, so this is another really interesting. You just laid it all out. But going back to the summer, it was a curious signing because of style of play, both D'Antoni and of course, kind of like the Houston Rockets Daryl style of play. And, you got a ball holder, mid-range scorer who's still a very competent scorer, maybe not as efficient, but just doesn't really fit in their style of play. And now you add in the fact that they lost, Mbah Moute, they lose Trevor Ariza. They try to backfill those positions, and then early on there's a suspension, and the team gets off to a rough start. And, who would have thought that they're right? They're currently 12th in the West. And so my gut is that there's not that much more to it other than what we're seeing. And then you add in you mentioned Dwayne Wade, thinking about this coming into this call, Dwayne Wade didn't fit in Cleveland, and they had to find like a a very professional way out for Dwayne to get back to Miami. And sometimes as players age, this can be a difficult time because especially if they're not 3-point shooters in the current game. And so players age, they change, style of play is not the great fit. You add in a couple other factors and all of a sudden Houston's underperforming. And you know what? They're probably not going to have to play Melo. My guess is they probably said, look, we're probably not going to play you. His representatives probably said, let me go try to find another spot. And Houston's probably trying to hedge and protect Melo in case they can't find another spot around the league. If they can find another place for Melo, another home for Melo around the league, my gut is you're going to see a nice clean exit out of this thing and it's going to go well. If they can't find an exit for Melo in another spot that's going to be, highly respectful and professional, then it's going to be really tough. Either he's going to, end up not in the rotation or they're going to end up just walking away and he's going to go home until somebody has a spot for him. And my gut is it's as simple as that.
Yeah, I think I wonder with like the illness, quote unquote illness, if it's just like he didn't want to have a DMP or something on his, or something like that. Didn't want to say. But the thing is, like last year in Oklahoma City, there were fourth quarters. He started, but there were fourth quarters when he didn't play, and I think he handled that okay. So I feel like still like there's some sort of disconnect here where there's a piece missing to the story a little bit.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. My gut is we're probably seeing the most of it, but how do you know until it comes out? And, sometimes it's just the team's performance, right? And they've kind of underperformed and kind of tell him he's not going to, probably communicated that he's not going to play. Oklahoma City for the most part last year was still winning in those games or, highly competitive in those games. And Houston was on the verge of, getting underwater here in the West from a team that was, their expectations were to contend. Their expectation right now is to be second or first in the West. And so from their performance to their expectations, it may be as big a gap as anybody we've seen in the league.
Yeah. Would you count them as the most desperate team right now as far as shaking things up? I know Miami is another in that category. Ethan Skolnick wrote something basically where quoted an exec saying like we need a trade bad. I imagine Houston is in that category too.
I don't know if Houston has a top 5 player and then an all-time great in Chris Paul. So I would bet that Houston is not like in panic mode, though Houston is always one of the most aggressive teams in trade and trying to improve. But Houston only does deals that they're going to feel really good about. Houston's not one to overpay to try to do something early or drastic. My guess is, not having Chris Paul for those games, they're going to steady the ship. They've won a couple of games here. They got a huge game tonight. Tonight's going to be fun. Right. Golden State at Houston.
Absolutely.
So this game will be a great measure, even though it sounds like Steph still isn't playing. And, but you're going to see like a Kyle Korver who's been rumored and been talked about around the league as potentially on the move. You're probably going to see a Kyle Korver in Houston or a Kyle Korver in Philly or Kyle Korver, in Oklahoma City or one of these teams would be, my gut, and probably more so the teams that have underperformed a little bit. I would say the most desperate teams, like if you want to look at like a huge gap, it's when that payroll is really, really high and, a team is just kind of okay to average and then underperforming because you may not have the hope that you can, you're going to kind of improve to the mean, right? Where a team that maybe has just got kind of middling expectations, but they're far below that, they may not be able to improve to the mean. And that's when I think you get the desperation for some drastic action.
The team that kind of strikes me as an odd one, Wes, and I'm thinking about, depending on the organization, how do you turn the temperature down in that room when you're having a meeting with your owners in your front office and trying to figure out, hey, we thought we were going to be this, and we look up after 14 games and we're 7-7 as Utah. They came into this season with a lot of people forecasting them being a top 3 team, in the West. Oh, they're going to be top 3. And they haven't performed like that so far, at least to this point in the season. How do you turn that temp down? Like, if you're the GM, how do you go in there and say, hey, we need to be patient? Or if you think, hey, we got to do something, like how does that conversation go when you're dealing with owners who want a different set of results maybe than what a coach understands you're going to get 14 games in and what a general manager understands what you're going to get 14 games in?
Yeah, so number one, they will not panic. Dennis Lindsay is one of the most steady, patient, and really accomplished executives in the league. What they have done in the draft, especially recently. And, there's a lot of talk about Donovan Mitchell. Unbelievable pick, right, at 13. It's an even better accomplishment when you factor in the fact they traded for the pick. A lot of people talk about Rudy Gobert. Unbelievable pick at 27. People don't talk about the fact they bought that pick at 27. So they traded in for both of those players. I mean, truly remarkable. And then, a guy like Joel Ingles kind of comes out of nowhere and has been fantastic for them. So I'd say a couple things. First of all, they're healthy this year. Well, for the most part, they're healthy. And, last year they had to battle through injuries and were kind of just okay. They get Rudy back. They get Rubio playing great, and they went on a great run late. They're a little bit similar that way in Philly last season. Philly won their last 16 to win 52 games or whatever they won. And, so that means they were, 36-30? Right. At one point, which was just kind of okay. So expectations for Philly going into this season were probably a little out of order, and expectations for maybe Utah going into this season with a great run at the end of the year might be a little above what they should be. But Donovan Mitchell, second year, the league probably has a better feel for him and how to defend him. He's the focal point. That changes things. They've gone through a stretch where they lost a bunch in a row. Last night, I haven't had a chance yet to watch last night's game. They got beat by a bunch, so I'm sure it doesn't feel great right now losing at Dallas like that. But they have a great ownership. Getting back to your original question, they have a great ownership group that's incredibly patient there in Utah with the Miller family. Dennis Lindsay is not going to panic. He's as steady and as measured as they come. And Quinn Snyder's a fantastic coach. And so my gut is they're going to steady the ship and they're going to be fine. But it is surprising to see them sitting at 7-7 right now coming in when we thought, this team may have a chance to be a top 4 team in the West.
Yeah, I think most surprising is they rank 18th defensively. And for this team to be, who they aim to be, that's, they're a top 1, 2, 3 defensive team in the league. And if you look at their numbers, it's weird. They with their scheme and, they like to have Gobert sit back and protect the rim. So they force a lot of those shots sort of in between the 3-point line and the restricted area. And the opponents are shooting ridiculously well on those shots sort of in between. And so I think you can hope for a little bit, there might be some noise in that, and that, maybe those numbers will come down to earth a little bit. But still, I think, that's the end of the floor that's been a little bit disappointment. And maybe you can point to the freedom of movement emphasis and that, and some teams having a tough time adjusting on that end of the floor. So we'll see. They have to be a top 1, 2, 3 defensive team, and right now they rank 18th. If you look at their schedule, they have, they've played a pretty even schedule as far as the offenses they faced. They've played, 3 games against Dallas already, 3 games against Memphis, and neither of those is a particularly potent offensive team. So I think they should be better than 18th defensively when you look at them.
Yeah, no doubt. That's where they were great last year. And, this is so interesting because they're coming off a good win in Memphis just a couple of days ago, even though you're right, Memphis isn't a potent offensive team. A couple things that jump out with Utah is that the dynamic between Favors and Gobert and playing those 2 big guys together as much as they do, that's a unique one, especially with kind of the modern league, the way the game's being played. And I know they got Favors shooting some corner threes, but that's an interesting one. And so that may have some of that defensive impact or effect, even though last year that team late was great, especially the way Favors played in the playoffs. Yeah. And then 2 other things, trying to work back Dante Exum and Alec Burks has got to be a challenge for them. This team is playing a lot of guys, a lot of minutes. They got a deep rotation. And so I know some of that's going to be by design with Quinn to try to get guys out there and continue to develop the team and manage both the future and the current. But certainly this team's going to have to improve defensively to be what we thought they were going to be.
Yeah. Wes, I was thinking, you mentioned, we talk about Utah's dynamic and Dallas, that team came up. Clearly not the team they were years ago, but I was thinking about their young talent and particularly Doncic. And what's the dynamic when you're sorting through how you select players at the top of a draft in terms of what you weigh as most important in a draft prospect? Like, I was sitting there last year like everybody else debating, is Doncic the number 1 pick because of what he's done at the age that he did it in Europe? Or do you put more value on the fact that you've seen DeAndre Ayton and some of these other, players here in the States as they come through their one season of college or whatever it is. How do you go about unscrambling that draft matrix when you're talking about prospects, when there isn't a clear-cut number one guy who makes himself above and beyond the obvious choice at that number one pick?
Yeah. Evaluating typically comes down to the preferences or the priorities of the organization or of the kind of evaluator. Mm-hmm. You know, whoever that kind of final decision maker is. And so it's some teams, you know, prioritize athleticism and length. I think this is part of the reason why you see a lot of these really tall, long, athletic players go very high in the draft that are the guys that don't pan out to maybe be as good as, you know, teams thought they would be. And those guys typically lack the competitive makeup, the skill set, you know, maybe the IQ and the work rate. And so my experience was always to kind of prioritize those characteristics, work rate, competitiveness, basketball IQ, skill level, and then a level of personal character, you know, reliability, accountability, you know, some level of empathy, you hope. But really it's about trying to balance those two. And then specifically with Doncic, like I thought that this kid was going to be really good. I did a draft show last year and said on the air that, you know, I thought he was in the top two in this draft with Ayton and him. And, you know, you could have made an argument to take either one, I thought. Mm-hmm. And Doncic has certainly lived up to it. And what you're saying, you know, he was beat up because he was maybe, quote unquote, not the most athletic in the current NBA. Could he do what he did in Europe in the NBA, where the game is more athletic and faster? And what you're saying is an elite skill level. You're seeing, you know, high level competitiveness and a great mind translate like that. What to me looks like the clear cut rookie of the year.
I'm always caught off guard too with, you know, this immediate need to grade drafts. And I know that drives between player comps and grading drafts. Yeah. I know there's nothing that drives front office people crazier than this immediate knee jerk reaction based on the first month of a guy's rookie season. And I think back to a guy like Chauncey Billups even. I remember how many times I heard he was a bust. Or Joe Johnson, how many times I had somebody tell me he was a bust. And then you look up 10, 13, 14 years later, these guys are still in the league, playing at a high level. But does the front office ever outlive a bad draft choice? I know you don't get credit for a great one because whoever drafted LeBron is never going to get credit for taking LeBron instead of Darko. Like, that's not –
Jim Paxson. Jim Paxson drafted LeBron.
You know, that's never going to happen. But if you're taking Darko, he'd be, you know, he'd go down in history, you know. But, yeah, can you ever outlive that? I've talked to other guys about that as well, just how finicky the success rate can be based on all these different factors that as an organization you really have no control over. How much a guy wants to be great, how hard he wants to work, you know, how realistic he is about what he is when he comes into the league and whether or not he's willing to, you know, swallow that and dig in. I mean, there's all these other variables that go into it.
Yeah. So your kind of initial question is like I think your initial question is about the immediate need to grade draft picks. And the amazing part about this is how much these decisions change over time.
Right.
We could go here. We could do an entire podcast on just, if, you know, how a decision was initially a mistake, then it was a good one, and then it ends up being a mistake again. You know, I mean, and there are countless examples of it. One that jumps to mind right now is Buddy Hield in Sacramento. Buddy Hield's having an amazing run right now in Sacramento. Dave Yeager, that team's not getting talked about enough. Dave Yeager has to be, you know, in conversation for Coach of the Year. And I know it's early, but that team is way playing above what anyone thought they would be. And Buddy Hield's been a huge part of that. And Buddy was, quote, you know, a disappointment taken in the draft just up to a year ago. And so decisions have a tendency to change over time. And that's why you hope you have – this is going back to why it's important to have a great management team and ownership group that has the long view and a coaching staff that understands it takes time, you know, to develop these players, because we're trying to draft them over the life of their career, and we're trying to draft the best player over the life of their career. And a 19-year-old isn't ready to play maybe, and that's way pre-prime until 23 at their prime, when that's when they're likely going to have their best run from 23 to 30. And so understanding that, having patience, you know, focusing maybe not on productivity, but on progress for a young player. And so yes, that is certainly one of the parts that is really hard for a front office to kind of live through, that immediate evaluation of all these decisions. And then to your other kind of question regarding can an organization live past it? You know, there's always opportunities to kind of live past bad decisions. But it typically is a result of the team performing and winning.
Yeah.
And other good decisions that have been made kind of in the presence of the bad decision. But if you miss on a great player, in the draft, like Giannis goes 15, there's a lot of teams that wish they had Giannis that might not be able to live passing on Giannis. And there's, a lot of people so far that have passed on Donovan Mitchell. Now Donovan Mitchell is a really good player, yet to be seen if he's going to be the level of like a Giannis at 15. But those decisions are hard to live past unless your team wins and you've made other good decisions in the presence of maybe a mistake. Because getting back to the management, the ownership piece thing is everyone's going to make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes that has done really good jobs in the draft. And even going back to Utah, Utah's had some picks really high that haven't quite worked out. Certainly Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert are better than Dante Exum at this point, and Exum was drafted higher than both.
Right. That's a great point. John and I debate on the regular, Wes, about the patience needed in this league. And I don't know that anybody has enough of it, not just specifically on players, but on teams. And how long does it take to turn around, a team that's trying to go from one station, one spot on the pecking order in this league to the next. You guys had a very specific challenge when you came here to Atlanta. And the Hawks, to me, it kind of got accelerated out of nowhere. I did not expect for the group that you guys put together here to be as good as they became as quickly as they did. When you look back at it now in hindsight, is that one of those deals where sometimes things fall into place in your position as an organization to take advantage of them? Or is it something that's maybe more serendipitous than that? Just sometimes you just get lucky and guys end up being better players than maybe what you imagine they'd be, or better fits even than what you'd imagine they'd be. Because the 60-win conference finals, Atlanta team caught a lot of people by surprise. That team came out of nowhere for a lot of people.
Yeah, no, it was, it really was a special run there, winning 17 games in the month of January, not losing in the month of January.
Yeah.
In a unique time and for the franchise. And really all of that at the end of the day, and this has not been said enough, Sekou, but, Danny Ferry really did a nice job of trying to balance multiple paths. Because we were looking at trades that maybe prior to building that team that maybe have taken us to, kind of more towards a younger group investing in the future. And we were looking at opportunities during that time to maybe take, to go after the higher level free agents that ended up going elsewhere. And so, that's why it's important to manage multiple paths. And almost every team is trying to do this in different ways. And that's why the middle of the NBA is oftentimes the hardest.
Yeah.
Like when you're a clear contender, that you're trying to find just the incremental improvement to help kind of support your best players. So that's kind of what, going back to, Philly again, like Philly's now going to be looking at the incremental improvement. Houston is going to be looking at incremental improvement because they already have their best players in place. And so that's a good place to be in the NBA. It's a challenging place because everyone's chasing the champion, but that's a good place to be. It's also kind of a comfortable place in when you're investing in the future and trying to find the next best player out of the G League, or you got multiple high draft picks and you may not be winning right now, but you're building towards something. When you're in that middle ground in the NBA, that's where it's the most uncomfortable because you're constantly juggling the future. You're trying to manage your current team. And then when you layer in free agency coming up for a lot of these guys, and especially in the current price, like in the current landscape where free agents are just, making a lot more money at the top.
Yeah.
And even that second tier is making more money. You got to make bigger decisions. And so we were that team in the middle, in 2012, and started with a Joe Johnson trade and had to transition. And really, we probably took advantage of maybe a landscape in free agency where there wasn't a lot of money to spend. After the Joe trade, we had some money to spend, and that, we spent it on a number of players that ended up being really, really good for us. And it was a good run. And, Bud's a terrific coach and really did a great job of maximizing that group. And so it was a special team that was juggling a lot of options, had great leadership from Danny and, great coaching from Bud. And, it worked out.
So oftentimes that's all it is, man. It's just right people at the right place at the right time in this league. You never know how it turns out.
It's interesting. I will say to that team, though, it was really interesting. Paul Millsap ended up with the Hawks because we were engaged in another conversation around another trade that we knew we were able to figure out was going to be made with Utah. There was a Golden State Biedrins Richard Jefferson trade, and we were kind of able to tell Paul and his representatives that, hey, look, we think this might be coming. If this trade happens between Golden State and Utah, you're going to have to be renounced because they're going to have to release your cap hold in order to take those two players in. If that happens, we're going to be here for you. And that the next day it happened exactly as we thought it might happen. And that, we were fortunate that Utah made that decision and Golden State had to make that decision. So then we were the beneficiary of, obviously a great player in Paul.
Are you guys ready for a trivia question?
Always ready for trivia. Wes, he pulls this out all the time at the end of the show, Wes, just to make me look bad and then make our guests look great because they get the answer right, and I'm still like Google trying to figure it out.
All right. So LeBron passed Wilt Chamberlain on Wednesday night to move into fifth place on the all-time scoring list. Now, with LeBron's move to LA, 5 of the top 6 scorers and 6 of the top 8 have played in NBA history have played for the Lakers.
Right.
So my question for you is, what other franchise have 3 of the top 10 scorers in NBA history played for? So in total, the top 10 scorers in NBA history have played for 17 different teams. And there are 7 of those teams that multiple guys in the top 10 have played for. The Lakers being, 6 of the top 10.
I'm already confused. You said that question's so long.
So there's another franchise there's top 10 scorers in NBA history. I'll go. There's Kareem, Karl Malone, Kobe Bryant, Michael Jordan, LeBron James, Wilt Chamberlain, Dirk Nowitzki, Shaquille O'Neal, Moses Malone, and Elvin Hayes. Mm-hmm. 6 of those guys have played for the Lakers. There's another franchise that 3 of those guys have played for.
Let me see.
I mean, Boston jumps out right away. But
no, only one. Only it's
only
Shaq.
Larry Bird.
Yeah, Shaq.
No, Larry
Shaq's
Bird's not in the top 10. Yeah, the only player in the top 10 in all-time scoring that's played for the Boston Celtics is Shaquille O'Neal.
This is always a trick question, too, by the way, Wes. It's always like...
And John, I'm with Sekou. I need you to ask the question like a 5th time.
All right. Top 10 players. Top 10 players all time NBA scoring. Kareem, Karl Malone, Kobe Bryant, Michael Jordan, LeBron, Wilt Chamberlain, Dirk, Shaquille O'Neal, Moses Malone, Elvin Hayes.
Oh, it's Washington.
Washington,
yep.
Yes.
See
there it is.
The guest gets it again while Sekou's sitting here scouring Google trying to figure out.
Michael Jordan, Moses Malone, Elvin Hayes all played for the Bullets or Wizards.
I think we forget.
Well, I was going to say, I never use the team name.
Yeah, I never count Jordan's Washington time against him either. I know people are. I mean, he was still getting buckets, but.
So the other ones with multiple guys is Cleveland, LeBron and Shaq.
Yeah.
Houston, Moses Malone and Elvin Hayes.
Right.
Miami, LeBron and Shaq. Milwaukee, Kareem and Moses. Philly, Wilt and Moses.
And Moses played for a lot of teams.
And that's it. Yeah, and then so Washington and the Lakers.
Moses Malone, man.
He played for San Antonio too. So that's it's the one. Man. Don't forget.
He got around. Good for Moses.
Wow, it feels like there's a trivia question here, and not that like I'm the furthest thing from a trivia guy, but like who would have thought you could get somebody now like 15 games in the season, San Antonio, Utah, New Orleans, and Houston in the Western Conference would not be in the playoffs.
Yeah,
that feels like a trivia question to this point. It's amazing. And Sacramento, the Lakers, the Clippers, Denver, and Memphis are all in.
That's crazy. Let's hope it's not a trivia question in mid-April because it'll be NBA Armageddon.
Then you'll definitely have some panic.
Yeah.
Then you'll definitely have some panic.
We're 2 weeks from that 20-game mark, and I think Western Conference teams, like if you aren't at least like 9 wins in the Western Conference through 20 games, like you better start thinking about, I mean, obviously you can turn that around, but as I said, like the standings at 20 games is very close to what the playoff teams at 20 games are very close to what the playoff teams will be at the end of the season.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch.
So 2 weeks from now, we can have some more serious discussions about teams that are or are not in playoff position.
Yeah. And we didn't even talk about the Lakers.
Exactly.
I mean,
exactly.
Which is a fascinating thing.
They're in the midst of what I think could be doing what I expected them to do this year, which is I didn't think the West was particularly strong. Everybody else thinks, oh, the West's so great. I'm like, it's deep and balanced, but I don't know that I think it's the Warriors and everybody else.
Yeah.
And therefore, the Lakers have just as good an opportunity to climb in the Western Conference standings as anybody. Portland has shown us this year that they're very capable of being a team, like that. Denver early on has shown us. Oklahoma City was underwater, 0-4 to start, and are now back in that top 4 mix. So you have no idea who rises up between it. I say Christmas. Christmas is always my test. I look up at the standings on Christmas Day and say, who's in position to keep going up and whose trajectory is maybe going in the opposite direction.
Yeah, no doubt. It's going to be a lot of fun. The Lakers are going on a 3-game trip, or about to start a 3-game trip that's really important for them. Orlando, Miami, Cleveland. And they've been playing, as I agree with you, as kind of what I thought they could be.
Yeah.
And the West, I agree, is also not quite as top heavy as people thought going into it. So there's a great opportunity here for the Lakers.
We thought Utah and Houston were probably 2-3-2 or 2-3 in some order, and they've been
less than that so far, without question. Yeah. Wes Wilcox, appreciate you taking some time joining us, man. Always good to pick your brain. All that knowledge you got hanging out up there, man. Share it.
Thanks, Sekou, John. It's been fun to chop it up here with you guys.
No doubt.
Thanks, Wes.
We'll be back Monday, of course, with a new show breaking down our rankings and all the stuff that goes on during the weekend. Be sure to subscribe to Hang Time on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts for a new episode every Monday and Thursday all season long. Please leave a review. For John Schumann, our producer John Hartzell, and our guest Wes Wilcox, this is Sekou Smith. We'll see you right here next time on the Hang Time Podcast.